Okay, so the new definition of reality, which means a new theory, or at least another variant of the same theory, is that reality is the totality of all reference, which means that if I can refer to it, then it's real. So I also noticed while I was sitting thinking about this is that there's two words that we could use to describe what that is. We could say that it's existent, which I think is more conventionally applicable. And we could say that it's real, which I think is closer to what the layperson would call it, but it's not as technically accurate. Because usually when we talk about reality, we're talking about all the dimensions included in there. And if I'm saying that it's a totality of all the reference, then that's not the same thing as saying that it's a totality of, that existence is a totality of all reference. Because if I say that a falsehood exists, that's not the same thing as saying that a falsehood is real. So I don't know if I'm going to go with reality as being a totality of all reference, or if I'm just going to call that existence, because I think it's really more close to existence. And if it is existence, that is what that is. Then I'm talking about what exists and what doesn't exist, simply dependent upon whether or not I can refer to it. And if I can refer to it, then it's considered existent. If I can't refer to it, then it's considered non-existent. And so then you might say, well, then at what point would you ever say something doesn't exist? Because if I say that there is something to refer to, then it must exist. So that there isn't anything that does not exist. There's no such thing as non-existence then at that point. Because if there were, then I would refer to that, and then it would exist. In fact, even to call non-existence is to refer to it, which is to turn it into a referent, which paradoxically then makes it existent. So does non-existence exist? If I can refer to it as non-existence, then does that not exist? And I guess I would say globally, non-existence does exist, but locally it doesn't, because anything that's inside the boundaries that define non-existence from existence would necessarily not be able to be referred to and would necessarily be beyond the limits of existence. But non-existence itself as a totality can be referred to, and so then you can say that that does exist. Non-existence as a totality exists, but locally, inside of itself, it doesn't exist. And so then it makes this sort of an I limit, which is really just the edge of existence. It's not actually non-existence at all. Then what that does is it gives us a reference frame that's so huge that you can't possibly say that I missed anything, because if you say that I missed X, then you're referring to X, and then X automatically becomes absorbed into it. So by simply bringing it to my attention, you've already disproven yourself. So that, I guess, would be unquestionable. You could do that, but the only purpose of that would be that it's so vast and so vague that it says almost nothing. And that's actually okay, because what that does is it's making a limit, and it's making it known that there does exist this totality called non-existence, that there is something that's in existence beyond existence. Again, paradoxically. So you have to focus on that, or I have to focus on that and figure out what use that is, what the way that works is. So if I'm going to say that the totality of all reference compose of existence, then I'm going to also include non-existence as an existent, But this is the thing, is it's an empty pocket. It's surrounded by other reference, so it's surrounded by existence, but inside of itself is a hole, so that there is not anything local in it. And what that does is it basically makes the reference frame so huge that it looks like the only things that don't exist are at the center rather than at the periphery. But that's, that's a very weird thing that I just noticed. Where is non-existence in comparison to existence? Because if non-existence, the zeroth dimension, right? Or not the zeroth dimension, the zeroth referent. That must be the zeroth referent. Okay, so the zeroth referent is non-existence. Well, that makes sense because that's the state in which nothing is being referred to. The zeroth referent equals non-existence. So inside of non-existence, there is nothing that exists. This is starting to remind me a lot of nothing. Okay, inside of non-existence, nothing exists. But yet, non-existence itself exists as a totality. I limit of existence. But that makes it at the center of existence. That's really strange. So at the center of existence, there is non-existence. You would think that non-existence would be something that would be beyond the periphery of existence, not within it. But like I said, the definition that I've used here is very strange. If existence is simply the totality of all things that can be referred to, and I can refer to non-existence, and non-existence necessarily cannot contain anything that exists, then it must be smaller than existence, and therefore it must be at the center of existence rather than at the periphery, or the volume, because if there isn't anything that's being referred to, and it's totally surrounded on all sides by everything else that can be referred to, or it has parts within itself that can be referred to, then I guess that would be the distinction between something that would be considered real and unreal is something that would have that integration of its parts. Because if there are no parts, then they can't integrate. And so then it's still disintegrated inside of non-existence because there are no parts or localities within non-existence that we can refer to. So they would necessarily be unable to integrate with each other. And they would necessarily be dependent upon the limits of non-existence because they're not being referred to by definition. And they can't be interactive because there's nothing in there to interact with because there's no reference there. So the inside of non-existence is certainly non-existent, but the periphery of non-existence is existent, which is really strange. I mean, you could almost consider that to be the origin of existence, is non-existence, because non-existence would have nothing inside of itself, but yet it would constitute a peripheral edge of existence. And then it would say, this is the edge of existence, and that exists. And then because that exists, then all these other things can exist afterwards. So this new definition seems to be far more in line with my old way of thinking about things anyway, because this recenters the whole thing on uh, non-existence once again. This, though, isn't necessarily the same thing as nothing, but it could be, but it doesn't have to be. If I simply leave it as non-existence is just not referring to anything, or a state in which there are no referents, while that does include nothing, it isn't nothing, because nothing is a specific type of non-existence, I think, because nothing isn't even, it's not just missing reference, it's missing everything, no matter if it's a referent or not. Even if it weren't a referent, it still wouldn't include that. So I might be able to say that nothing exists at the center of non-existence, or perhaps the volume. Oh, because then if it's a referent, then I can say that that's something to do with discerning. Because I can say, if something isn't discernible, then I can't really refer to it. But that's not true, though. I can actually refer to things that I can't discern, like nothing and indiscernibility. So, yeah, I'm going to have to play around with that. It's really interesting.